name is William del Pilar, and you are on Fired Up. And let's get right into it. Tonight, we are going to talk with our guest, Karen Roseberry, on the latest SCOTUS decision, which is a big one. And Karen's going to fill us in on that. First of all, Karen is a California native with a bachelor and master's degree in political science. She spent years working in education, politics, and project management. Karen has managed state assembly and congressional campaigns, and that will be key tonight. And she's worked in varying capacities in state senate and gubernatorial races. And she was also a candidate for California's 2016 United States Senate seat. Her focus and passion include grassroots cultivation, training, and development. Let's welcome Ms. Karen Roseberry. Karen, as always, thank you for coming on. Your knowledge does help educate the masses, and we truly appreciate it. How are you tonight?
I'm well. William, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate it, and I always look forward to the opportunity to keep you in check as well, too.
Well, tonight we are going to discuss a very heated topic, and you will tell us about the decision and ramifications. But to the average novice out there, Roe versus Wade was overturned. There's a lot of, I'll be frank, there's a lot of lying going around by the other side, because the most powerful tool in politics is emotion. Translation, emotional hate. And that's what we're seeing right now. So we need you to really educate the people as to what this decision means. My first question to you, when this decision came down, what were your initial thoughts? Surprise, vindication, expectation? What went through the mind of somebody who's been in the trenches and fought the political wars?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think after the Politico leak of the potential decision, which turned out to essentially be the decision, there wasn't nearly as much surprise over the final delivery that we saw on Friday. So I think that there is certainly an element of surprise for kind of a generation that has been under the Roe decision, but this is not unprecedented by any stretch of the imagination with the Supreme Court of the United States. So just to back up a little bit, yes, it was kind of introduced that Roe was overturned. The overturning of that decision was with the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Jackson. But one thing that needs to be called out super clearly, because it's being misstated, it's being inferred, it's being implied, and it'll go in a whole lot more directions as well. But this did not ban abortion. In no way, shape, or form did this decision implement a federal or a constitutional or a nationwide ban on abortion. It did overturn Roe v. Wade, which had prohibited states from passing legislation that regulated abortion in a number of ways. And so what this decision did is it kicked it back to the states. And by kicking it back to the states, we mean that the states now actually have to do what they were supposed to do all along, and that's hash out the legislation for what their constituents, what their voters, what their residents want within their borders. And so we're seeing a lot of different responses from a lot of different states across the country.
Right. So how does this jive with the Constitution, though? I mean, this is terrible. This is 7th, 8th grade history, what we should be learning. But yet so many people are oblivious. Can you just simply tell the audience exactly how it breaks down constitutionally?
Absolutely. And I think it's super important, because I was already hearing even just, constitutional law pundits kicking around, what has to be done. And at least it was accurate in conveying that if abortion were to be outlawed, it would require a federal law. Really, because of the controversy surrounding this, it's going to require a lot more than a federal law, because otherwise we would see Congress flipping back and forth and the law constantly changing. So that's not going to be what's happened, and that has not been what's happened. And in 2016, Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, and no such federal law was ever passed or even proposed to ban abortion. So this is a fear-mongering tactic that we're hearing. I want to answer your question, though, so I'm going to keep going for 1 second, and then you can jump in with a question. What would have to be done if there was ever to be a banning of abortion would be a constitutional amendment, would have to be added to the United States Constitution. And it does need to be distinguished that that is separate from each of the state constitutions, because later in the show, we might talk about what California is doing a little bit. But to get a constitutional amendment passed, it requires 2/3 of both houses. So that's the House of Representatives and the United States Senate to say, this is the constitutional amendment language that we want to see passed. And then 3/4 of the states have to approve that language by their state legislators passing it through. Sometimes state legislators will send it to the voters for a vote of a constitutional amendment of that nature, but it has to be passed by 3/4 of the states in the manner that they've set up and prescribed for the passing of the amendment. So 2/3 in both houses plus 3/4 of the states would be necessary to pass a constitutional amendment. We are far, far from that. And that's why it has had this blanket level of authorization by the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court was never a legislative body. They never actually passed a law. They simply struck one law down, and in striking that law down, it prohibited states from passing other laws. And now the Supreme Court is saying that law shouldn't have been struck down because it overstepped the authority of the federal court system. It is a states' rights issue. It's not spoken about in the United States Constitution. States do need to hash it out and pass their own laws to determine what regulation will be in place for abortion within their borders.
Right. It boils down to, if it's not in the Constitution, it's a state's issue. The other thing that people don't realize is this is a political potato, hot ball, whatever the term is. I forget what they used to call it. But in
Hot potato, right? Yes.
This is something politicians want to stay away from. So in essence, to me, that's why this was never brought up in Congress. It's that divisive of an issue. And the Supreme Court was kind of like their cover, because when this was always discussed or debated, the other side could never legally give it justification in terms of outside of SCOTUS rule, and I think most scholars eventually knew this day would come, because it's kind of a no-brainer in terms of where it belongs. And the hate that's being ginned up, again, to me, we're not going to talk about it, but just ties into how poorly our education system is, where people aren't taught, nor are they taught to critically think, and we have a battle on our hands because we have a public that is uneducated. So let's take a look at that battle right now. And in California and in various other states, the Democratic Party is already ginning it up this way. They're taking your ability to have an abortion away, and we're going to save you. Now, that's how they're saying it. But yeah, they can save it at each state level, but that's not the message they're sending. They're sending a message of hate. So when you look at that Republican, all you see is somebody who took your rights away. The good thing for us is I don't think that's working as well. But from a political standpoint, what does the GOP have to do locally, state, local levels, and what do they have to do nationally? I don't know if they're two different strategies, but how do you see that?
Sure. So the talking point mantra that we're hearing is that Roe is on the ballot. And it goes back to kind of that I personally believe kind of a fear-mongering tactic of trying to suggest that if the House and the Senate flip, you're going to see a federal ban on abortion. Again, 2016, Republicans in control, no such thing. Now, admittedly, maybe there would have been this battle over, whether they could or couldn't under the Roe decision, but the federal law was always what was the question of what would trump what in terms of the hierarchy of decision making. Was it a federal law? Was it a state law? Was it the Supreme Court decision? So the Supreme Court decision basically has now pulled back this blanket or this cover that we were talking about here. And so they've left it to the states. If it ever became a federal law issue, because it's so controversial, it's going to have to be a constitutional amendment. What does this mean politically? Well, it means that there's a lot of politicians that know that voters didn't read the Constitution, didn't pass their 8th grade, civics class, or at the level that it once was actually taught in the state of California. And they hear the talking points of, oh no, if we get, this, party in control, then it means, this, even though that's not at all what the reality and what the facts are saying. So as a result, we're seeing a lot of California electeds becoming that single issue vote. And the reason why it matters so much in California, and we'll talk about some of the other states in comparison to that, is just because of the number of congressional seats that are here and the ones that are even potentially up for grabs. Every seat is going to matter in the battle to retake the House or to take the House and control the House. And so the number of seats in California that are here will have a sway on that. Is it possible that the House is retaken without California? That's a nice little map game that we could probably talk about as we get closer to November of, which seats are going to go which way and how many seats are going to go for each party in the House. But in California, every Democrat is making this the focal point and the central issue because they don't want to talk about homelessness. They don't want to talk about the horrible inflation, the abysmal economy that's going on. Interestingly enough, just before our podcast, or maybe an hour or so before, Newsom did finally put out a tweet about, we've got a budget. I think he finally realized, people do care about other issues besides abortion, especially in California. And maybe we should remind them that, we are doing something about that budget. But between the economy, public safety, homelessness, those issues are all being swept under the carpet under this guise of abortion.
Now, that said, is this issue enough to trump kitchen politics? And for the audience, kitchen politics, when you hear kitchen politics, what we're talking about is issues that directly impact the family. It's called kitchen politics because in the old days, the husband and wife would be talking about how are we going to pay the bills, or what about this cost or that cost. And that's what's happening this cycle. So is this politics of hate strong enough to overcome kitchen politics for the average individual?
Well, I think as we get closer to November, we're going to see just what those kitchen table politics issues are being discussed. This right now is going to be a little bit of a topic at the kitchen tables of a lot of homes in America, and it will be kicked around. Is it still going to be at the forefront of that discussion in November if gas prices continue to sit at $6 and $7 a gallon, especially in California, and high 4s and 5s across the nation? Is it going to be that way if the inflation rates continue to rise, as is seen to be very possible, depending on international instability? There's very little talk about what's going on in international politics right now, and that's a little bit disturbing because the instability that takes place at that level has a significant economic effect. And so while this misdirection is going on of look over here, they're taking away your abortion rights, which is completely false and unfounded. First of all, it's not a right. And second of all, it hasn't been taken away. But regardless of both of those issues, that's consuming far too much oxygen in this conversation so that those other issues are not getting the attention that they need and deserve. Will that happen in November? Not sure.
This trip to Saudi Arabia, I think the Democrats are hanging more on that than they're letting on. And the truth of the matter is, from my understanding, we pulled back on Yemen, and that's where Saudi Arabia wants us to invest more to support them. We're doing a lot for Ukraine, but we're letting a lot of people die in Yemen. And the media does not talk about that. Again, the hypocrisy. But the reason I bring that up is I think that issue is very strong in the Saudis going, take a hike, Dementia Joe, or take a hike, Biden. I don't know, but if they don't get what they want out of Saudi Arabia and OPEC, I think this issue can get worse because they're still doing nothing to open up anything in the U.S. to ease this. And even Obama said, what Biden is doing, Obama had called gimmicks in the past. So I don't see kitchen politics going away. But the one positive I do see with social media, the internet, a lot of uninformed. Let's go back to California real quick. And this isn't just California. You're talking the whole Southwest, in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, even in Florida. There'd be a lot of first and second generation immigrants. When I say second generation, the kids who still speak Spanish, who grew up like my parents. You know, the first ones here to America, not immigrants, but first one here to America. But I grew up speaking both languages. They can't. A lot of times people don't realize we're clueless. We make a lot of assumptions, but now it's black and white. The Democrat Party is full-throated in support of abortion, not for the first X amount of weeks, but to conception. And that is, as I said last time, that's brown gold in those hills.
Right, but they're supporting it full term without restrictions up until birth in too many cases. And that's exactly what we're seeing, especially in this knee-jerk extremist response. You know, California is going to have on the ballot an amendment, a proposition to amend the state constitution to enshrine abortion rights. Now, the problem with this on a number of levels is that the way that the amendment reads, there's no restriction, there's no limitation. That's in contradiction to current law that we already have. And it's out of the mainstream opinion as well. You know, when people drill down just a little bit on those polls about that most Americans support that, you know, that they wanted, you know, Roe to, you know, remain, you know, in place, and that they didn't support the overturning of Roe. When asked a follow-up question to that as to whether or not they believe that there should be restrictions on viability, on age, on, you know, the going into that greater detail of just the protection of life as it get, you know, as the baby gets closer to delivery, people's opinions change with their comfort level of the taking of that life. Right. And I think that's where we really need to focus this conversation. And there also has been a complete absence of discussion. And talking to your first point about that emotional component that is being completely missed and needs to be drawn back in but redirected properly is the harm to women that comes from abortion. Study after study, case after case, individual after individual will tell you that there is an emotional experience that each woman will have as a result of that abortion. And more often than not, it is not a positive emotional experience. Now, it can vary in range, but there are many women who will liken their experience with abortion to that of a trauma or a traumatic effect that has taken place in their life. And this mantra of, oh, this is stripping women of their rights is just a fiction. It is trying to blind them to the fact that what they're doing is actually self-harm. Right. That conversation is not being had anywhere in the public square because it's, oh, we're, you know, rolling back, you know, rights 50 years ago. It's like this, it used to be, all right, that Republicans and Democrats could at least agree that abortion was an undesirable outcome. Exactly. Okay. You know, I mean, you know, Clinton, safe, legal, and rare. Okay. The rare component to abortion has been absolutely lost in the discussion. It is consistently about expanding access. It's about, if you break down expanding access, that's trying to say, have more abortions. I mean, even in Los Angeles County, you will read the documented paperwork that for women 45 and under, 1 in 4 pregnancies have ended in abortion. Wow. That's tragic. Wow. Okay, that is, and that means that those women are carrying that experience with them. And there needs to be a lot more conversation about that, because as we already face various episodes of mental health, whether it's anxiety, depression, dependence, you know, substance abuse and dependency issues. All of these things are only made worse by experiences that are never well dealt with and that can be traumatic to an individual. And again, the studies clearly show that this, for far too many women, is a traumatic experience. And that conversation you don't hear brought up whatsoever by politicians with platitudes of trying to make this their political talking point for reelection. They
Right.
don't care about the women as they're talking about this being a women's issue.
And
And
you know
that
what?
needs to be hammered on them.
Exactly. And you know who could lead that charge? Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank here. Which one was Roe? Which one was Wade in the sense of the abortion battle? Who was for who? You remember?
I believe it was Jane Roe, which was actually a pseudonym, if I'm not mistaken. Although actually, yeah, I feel like it was Jane Roe, but that actually wasn't her
That's what I want to
name.
say.
But
that woman-
normally it's normally it's the, well, she could have been the plaintiff in that case. So yeah, normally it's plaintiff versus defendant. So
But that woman has wanted the SCOTUS to overturn, or has wanted Roe versus Wade overturned. I mean, there's your best face for this. The individual who was responsible for Roe versus Wade now wants it overturned. And I think all of that has to do with what you said. I've heard women talk, and it breaks your heart, because the women that I've heard talk, they're not young. They're like 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they've been carrying this pain since their 20s. And some of them in their minds are, I murdered my child, and they struggle to get up every day. I heard them talking, it's just, they cannot say the first few words without tears. And it's not an act, it's just, they carry that emotional pain. And I would imagine there's a lot of self-loathing in those women
too often
because of what they've done. And
yeah.
My issue isn't, I am against abortion. I am pro-life, but I believe we have to have certain mechanisms in place, period. That's just my belief, you know, but nobody wants to talk about it. On our side, it's God's will. And I'm like, that's not a winning argument. To me, the winning argument is that simple picture that shows the women and kind of the body and goes, that's one life and that's another life, because scientifically that's what it is. And we need to use science. We need to use science in layman terms, because at the end of the day, science now tells us, my belief was always from day one, once you get that heartbeat, it's a life. I am pro-life from that, you know, and that kept changing. Remember how that kept getting less and less in terms of what states were passing? So it's a losing battle for the left, but I feel that we have Jerry Lewis managing the GOP at times in terms of how to battle. So let me ask you this, though. Let's just make up a candidate, Joe Schmuckatelli. He's running in a congressional district. What message, you as a campaign manager, would you tell him to deliver, like say in a speech, or what points do you want him to hammer in to about this SCOTUS decision to educate the individuals?
Well, I think fundamentally that they need to just push back hard that no, this did not ban abortion. Okay, that's not what happened. That this has brought the discussion back to the states. If they're running in California, then it's incredibly unlikely that there's going to ever be any change to what is already, you know, the California law of the land. If they're running in another state, then it may very likely not be popular in that state. I mean, Wyoming and South Dakota, abortion is not popular there. In fact, I think the one abortion clinic that was in Wyoming eventually shut down because there wasn't a demand for it.
Right.
You know, we see, you know, Christine O, you know, certainly being bold in stances that are being taken there, because again, South Dakotans don't want abortion, and they'll back that up. You know, then we see, you know, far more, you know, liberal states that, you know, still are, you know, I mean, there's 6 states that currently have abortion without restriction up to birth, which, you know, I think that's the second key point that's there, is really talking about the science of the issue. So I think it's compassion for the women, which we just talked about before, but the science of human development that's there. You know, you can even call it fetal development if you want. Fetuses are humans, okay? Just like a teenager is a human. That's just a label that is given to a stage in human development. You know, toddler, infant, you know, these are all just labels that are given to various stages of human development. California Science Center has an amazing display, okay, that shows life developing in the womb. There is no way that a person can scientifically look at a 24-week-old child in the womb and not recognize that that's human life needing to be protected. And even right now, under existing California law, that baby would be protected. If this constitutional amendment passes as currently written and without any clarification, which it doesn't appear that there will be whatsoever, you're going to have a conflict and a contradiction between a state amendment, a state constitutional amendment, and existing state law that actually protects children that are viable. And again, we're seeing viability even younger and younger than that. But I would push on compassion for the women, that there are 2 victims at least in every abortion, and the science of human development are places that are easy talking points and can refute easily the Democratic talking points by reminding them that voters can speak on this specific issue. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing partisan decision.
You know, I'm also a believer in witnesses, for lack of a better word. If I'm on that campaign trail and I know women who have had abortions, I mean, that's what you have AIDS research and all that. I find those women who had those regrets, not to use them as showpieces, because you don't that's demeaning somebody, but you get them to talk about their stories, because there's nothing.
And there are women who want to, yes.
You know, there's nothing more powerful than that. And I don't know if you just said many women want to.
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Yes. And that makes it even more powerful, because they don't want their mistakes to be for younger people to make. When I teach people something about a screw up I did, I said, I'm telling you this so you don't make the same business mistake I did, period. My job is to make sure you don't do stupid stuff I do. That's how we evolve and get better, and businesses go from one level to the next. No different with abortion. Look, I believe it's a woman's choice, but I'm pro-life, only because I grew up with strong women, and they can make decisions. I believe the failure that we're seeing is that what we talked about, that lack of education. Again, I go back to the sonogram. Once I saw it in 6 years in the military, there was not one time, not ever one time in the beginning, yeah, I'm pregnant, gonna be a father, cigars, all that type stuff, you know, getting drunk, hammered. Then you saw the change is when and it never failed. They came in with the sonogram. They had it and they're pointing it out. Hey, this is this for us dumb idiots. What am I looking at? You know, but you saw it went from cigars and getting drunk to, oh my God, I'm going to be a father. You know, I mean, the responsibility. So I mean, this is human nature. This has been happening since throughout the annals of time. And we seem to forget basics with campaigning the Republican Party. I believe you take that process, the women, those stories, but I don't think you're going to get the word out unless you start walking the beat again, start walking those streets. And do you think this issue is going to get this cycle of Republican candidates out to go walk their districts with this message? Or do you think they're still going to count on the mail order ballots? You know, it's kind of like, to get their message across.
Right. Well, I don't think that there's a lot of Republicans that actually do want to talk about this issue because they don't feel comfortable with it for a number of reasons. I think that they should be countering the really bad talking points by the Democrats that we just talked about. And there's another word that I've seen kicked around a lot, especially again on the California side of things, about, you know, our California values. And I would push back strongly and hard about that as well. It used to be a value in our country that we would defend the helpless, we would defend the weak, we would defend those who couldn't defend themselves. And what we have right now are those without a voice, unable to speak for themselves, that are not having any protection afforded to them. Right. And it's tragic because we were all at that stage of development and someone protected us, and yet we will not return the favor of offering protection for the voiceless and the defenseless who just need time to grow. That's all that this is about. This is honestly an ageist elitism. It is essentially what this is about. It's I'm older than you are, so I don't have to, you know, protect you, defend you. It is, I don't even have to acknowledge you because you're too young and you have no voice. That's what this is coming down to.
Right, and we're gonna lose even worse if that's the case, because if they hear just because they're going to be hammering their points of hate in, and that's my issue with the Republican Party. One reason my previous business was successful, and it was one of the most successful within my industry, was because people thought I love confrontation. I don't. I loathe it, but I do know this: if you don't resolve issues or educate your employees so they understand why you're working the job you are, you're going to be part of the 90% of mom and pop businesses that fail. And this is a great opportunity to go in there and educate, even on the main points, as you say, about states' rights versus federal rights in basic issues. But me, I'm just tired. I'm the type of guy, if I'm a candidate, and this is what I would encourage candidates: have pictures of some of those abortions near the birth stage. Because that's what we don't do. A leftist will throw pictures of anything to gain an edge. I say we show the truth. The truth trumps all. Oh, that's a gimmick. No, it's not. That's a murder on that table right there. And these people need to understand that's what they're condoning, is murder when it can be prevented. Not to mention, there's so many other avenues, adoption being one of the main avenues. People don't remember, before Russia shut down the adopt a baby, you could get there. I mean, there were tens of thousands of babies coming out of Russia and China. Yep. So there's various ways to combat this, but if we stay silent on this, we will lose. I mean, just the hate alone. In fact, there's they're trying to sit there and say taking this away means that we're condoning forced pregnancy. Every time I see that on a timeline, I go, forced pregnancy is rape. You didn't have a choice in getting pregnant. Every other instance is not. It's your choice. Regardless of the outcomes, you chose to have sex. And it's the truth. Like AOC was saying, they're forced pregnancy. And I'm like, no, it's not. On the sailor side, somebody said, I am pro-choice. I am pro-condoms. So it's silly as it sounds. There's so many ways to combat this, and if our candidates are too scared, we should not be re-electing them during the primaries. I mean, I'm sorry, whatever the term is, but
general, right? Yeah,
we don't do that, and it seems like a vicious cycle. What can we do? When I say we, just in general, what do the politicians, the party, even though they're not really doing this, but what must happen to get that candidate, that Republican candidate, to talk about this? Because you're right, they don't want to talk about this, but if they don't, they're going to lose.
Well, it's interesting because Kevin McCarthy, our would-be future speaker, if he can get the enough Republicans elected to Congress, was actually tweeting pretty consistently on the Dobbs decision, and part of that is because that's very good for his fundraising. A lot of his fundraising comes from those that are pro-life and that are wanting to see this issue championed further, and so he's not going to miss that opportunity to certainly kind of throw some red meat at conservatives, because Republicans overwhelmingly, over 60%, actually, just a recent poll I happened to look at. I'm sure there's other ones with other numbers, but this particular one, at least 60% of Republicans, were, supportive of the Roe decision, being overturned. I think I've seen that in certain polls as high as 80% were supportive of Roe being overturned. So by all means, you're going to see, Kevin McCarthy, push out those positions and those statements of, this is where we're at. There's, still, more to be done. And so to use this, for fundraising purposes that are there. It wouldn't surprise me if we'll see other congressional candidates in more traditionally safe seats or safe, districts use it that way. Probably not California, although there might be some, like I say, in the north part of the state that might kind of pattern that. But the one thing that real quick, I was just saying, the one thing that I found kind of interesting, though, is that CAGOP has not yet issued a statement on Dobbs. And I think that that's because they're still wrestling through how do we respond to this so that our vulnerable candidates that aren't able to nuance and come through with just powerful enough talking points to overcome the Democratic deception. How do we defend them? How do we deflect? I mean, literally their press statements were all about, the gas, tax and prices and fire season. But I mean, it practically ignored the fact that we had a historical and momentous Supreme Court decision overturning Roe. And so it was a little obvious that something was missed.
That's incompetence. They've known for months now about this potential decision, and not to have something ready is nothing but sheer incompetence, and not surprising to me. We have this is me speaking, not Karen. As a Latino, I'll say it. We have a token Latina as our chair in a fixed election, not fixed as you would traditionally think, but through the proxy system we have, and we're still losing as badly as ever, and not to have a response ready is sheer incompetence. I want to get back to something you said about how our candidates here will play it. David Valadao, is that who it is?
David Valadao, yes.
Valadao. He's in a rural area.
Yes, he is. I believe it's Judy Salas, if I'm not mistaken.
With a lot of Latinos. Now, here's something that the left would say, see, he's being racist, derogatory, but I'm not. It's a fact. Most Latinos or rural workers tend to be uneducated and have a strong grip on God. That's how we're brought up. That's how we're raised. And my point in bringing this up is these are now Democrats he can win. Before, I think the left would go to them, hey, it's that white, evil, rich barrenness of a farmer, yada, yada, yada. But here's something that he can connect with his voters there. This, because correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the, I don't want to say toss-up elections, but it's more.
It's going to be close.
Yeah. So no, I look at this is if Valadao is too scared to bring this up, then he's bringing about his own potential demise, because this is something that once they learn that, and I saw this firsthand, and I talked to somebody who did it firsthand in Riverside, educating a lot of non-speaking, some of them were non-speaking, rather non-English speaking individuals who assumed their representative was pro-life, So to me, this is low-hanging fruit. I hate to put it in that term because it's a serious issue, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. Any thoughts? Am I looking at this completely wrong, or there's no relevance, or how do you see that race breaking down?
I mean, I think that, there'll be some pretty extensive polling that'll probably be done. But yes, I mean, historically speaking, and, traditionally speaking, and even demographically speaking, you would be inclined to think that those traditional family values would be issues to certainly put forth in conversation in that district. And so, I hope that Valadao can speak, strongly and passionately and powerfully, and go back to that value issue that, that this is a question of, life. This is a question of, defending the helpless. This is a question of that, again, your traditional, Latino families, are pro-life. Exactly that. They're Catholic, they're pro-life, and, they are not, typically going to be supportive of a position that goes contrary to that. Now, he's going to still have to address those other kitchen table issues that, we were talking about earlier on, in the show as well, because I don't think that they're solely and completely single issue voters. And that's really what I think this is going to come down to, is how much this one single issue is going to have a impact on voters, or whether or not they, are going to break out of this, because this is still early on. I mean, this is June and the election isn't until November. And there's a long way to go from June to November before, voters, actually cast that ballot. And even though, yes, they'll get their ballots in October, and so it's a little shorter, but the reality is that short-term memory of voters is a real thing, and they're fired up right now. But whether or not this is remaining the fired up issue, September, October, when those ballots, are actually hitting, right, that still remains to be seen.
It's so many months, and this has been an unpredictable year. how fast inflation rose, even though a lot of people predicted it, and not necessarily the inflation that came second, because people noticed the cost of the food, not realizing the inflation. So the term inflation doesn't become the norm until the gas price discussion, the beef discussion. Remember the bacon discussion, $72 for a pound, all that, and then eventually the next phase is this is inflation, and so it's kind of a layered effect, because what's next after inflation? We're getting ready to hit an official recession. And then so you get another term. So this is not boding well for Democrats. So the SCOTUS gun decision, the SCOTUS Roe versus Wade decision, to me, right now, that's all Democrats have. But Ukraine isn't getting better. That could get worse. They predicted Russia's downfall at the beginning of this Ukraine war. And I'm like, do y'all not ever see Afghanistan? Y'all not ever see any of the last non-war conflicts we had? Do y'all actually study strategy? These numbers of our tacticians said that they would take it in a month. I'm like, just to give you a point, this is what they were telling at the turn of the century in the 1920s about Central America and American sending Marines. We can handle this, not realizing these people are fighting for their lands. These people are fighting for what they feel is all they have left, or they're going to die. So we always miscalculate the human spirit. And so my point being is Ukraine, I think, has still got lots of room to blow up on. And I think that's still going to have a major effect. And my point being is some of the what the Democrats want out of this decision politically may not just be their kitchen politics, trumping it or not. Foreign policy may come in. It just seems that nothing has gone right. Do you see any silver lining, Karen, for the Democrats at this point in time? If we had to go to the voting booth next week, do you see any silver lining for the Democrats that they could go, no, this red wave is not going to happen?
Well, I think if it was next week, they would ride higher numbers on this decision, because I do think that there is a lot of passion and emotion that is driving people out right now. It's not driving people out at the numbers that they thought that it was. Even at the protest rallies, we're not seeing that. Thankfully, even the threats against pregnancy centers, which are a very real thing.
Yes.
There have been attacks. Ironically, the attacks more oftentimes are in states with the most liberal abortion laws. Colorado has seen them. I believe up in the Portland area, if I'm not mistaken, there have been attacks. But I mean, there was a group called Jane's Revenge that issued, warnings and statements that actually had LAPD on alert. Like I say, congressional members, were certainly reaching out to, organizations of faith, pregnancy centers, things of that nature, warning them, to be, heightened and be aware. All of that to say, though, is that there hasn't been as much of that visceral reaction that was potentially seen to be coming. We are seeing it, but we're not seeing it in, numbers that might represent, true gains or losses if that election, was next week. I think the other thing that is going to be at least reflective and somewhat representative of where the people really are at is going to be that constitutional amendment that's going to go to the voters in November. I think it's possible that could maybe, and this is very much a hypothesis, not a theory, like I say, testing it out, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility to at least hypothesize that it could be more competitive than even possibly state candidate races. So, in our state candidate races, we expect a pretty much 60-40 split. It's going to run on partisan lines. It just, and we've talked a lot about that in past shows. It'll be interesting, though, if this proposed state amendment, maybe doesn't fall closer to maybe a 45-55 split. Maybe the Latinos do get fired up and actually do. Maybe, maybe they still vote, Democrat, on other, components, but maybe the Catholic Church, maybe the evangelical church gets that message out on this particular issue, that this is extremist and knee-jerk. It did not think through viability at all. It didn't think through human development, science. It doesn't do anything for women. Maybe it becomes at least competitive on the ballot rather than just an automatic sweep as it's being pitched by the legislators now.
You know, I kind of think because like you said earlier, it's not a topic politicians want to talk about. That's why I think this change of the Constitution to our Constitution, the state's going to fly by. The only way it doesn't is if they're able to explain in layman terms what abortion up to conception is. Because as you said,
up to birth.
I'm sorry. Yes, conception is what is, yeah. Duh.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, abortion up to birth, right?
Up
Yes.
to birth. And again, I'm like, you got to be graphic with people because sometimes that's when they get it. Here's an abortion up to birth. You know, I would use that ex-Virginia governor. You know, the baby can be born okay, the mother's okay, everything's okay. And we put him in the room, then we're going to talk about murdering that baby if the mother wants, you know, between the mother and doctor. He didn't use the term murder. I would. I'm an Alinsky believer when it comes to political battles because you fight the left with their own weapons. If Russia sends atomic weapons our way or nuclear weapons, you don't think we're not going to retaliate? It's you got to fight fire with fire. One reason this pendulum swung so far to the left is because Republicans don't. They run away. So my next question to you is kind of twofold. Do you see, well, first of all, my belief in business, well, you don't like the way that company works, then quit and start your own. My belief is you don't like that state's laws, those states, then move to a state where they are amicable to you. The pushback is, well, I have a right to live in a state. And I'm like, no, you don't. You know, but that's the mentality, meaning my right and my beliefs. I don't care if I'm the only person in this state, the rest of the state has to abide by my rights and beliefs. So I don't think that argument works. So my belief has always been go to the state. Do you see a more splitting up of our country becoming more redder and more bluer because of Roe versus Wade?
I think that we're going to see probably a clearer delineation in terms of the law in those states. Yes, I don't necessarily know that anyone's going to truly move states because of this issue. I mean, you may have people travel to other states, and I mean, obviously, you know, that's been, you know, a big talking point and things like that. But, you know, I don't necessarily know. If you're trying to get to a state that allows abortion, you don't need to come all the way to California to do it. You know, depending on where you're at. You know, there's going to be, I mean, you know, depending on where you're at in the country, Colorado is probably going to be closer to you. You know, Oregon, Washington. I'm sorry?
It depends on the cost. If it's free here, like they're saying, we're going to get them in, even from the East Coast. Somebody will buy a $500, well,
in a state where it's already legal. Hey, free trip to California, even though I live in Massachusetts, where, you know, it's, you know, legal. Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay.
No, it sounds silly, but yes. And the other thing, I think that this could drive out more conservatives out of the state, not because they believe or don't believe, but our taxes are just going to keep going up and up. We're not talking 10, 20 million. We're talking hundreds of millions over time here, you know, and that money's got to come from somewhere, you know, so it's just going to be higher taxes. I mean, look at Newsom. He really doesn't want to give us a tax break because their whole plan is to normalize these high prices, then to shift us to electric cars, which are just as, which are inefficient in many ways, and create greater pollution because of the disposal issues. So I think you're going to see conservatives. I've actually talked to my wife. I said this could be the tipping point for us because if this goes for free and we start becoming the state Holiday Inn of people coming in for their abortion, and it may not be just other states. A lot of Mexicans from Mexico, because it's a border, will come up. People will fly in from other countries. Who knows? I don't know. I mean, it sounds stupid and silly, but think of how stupid and silly we were in our early 20s. I could see somebody going, when you have a shirt that says 9 abortions and counting, your mentality's off. I can see people creating trips to California around abortion, then going to Disneyland. Don't mock me, don't laugh at me, because that mentality is out there. I guess what I'm saying is this can get bad. Am I that off?
Well, what I'll say this to that point is that you're at least correct on the amount of money that could potentially be spent and is already being budgeted. That tweet that we were talking about in terms of the budget from the governor, I believe actually designated 200 million for reproductive care, money's going to that. And by reproductive care, that was essentially to support abortion is
Right.
what Newsom is basically saying.
Karen, could I forget what they're called, the family pregnancy centers, the people who try to educate, I guess what I'm asking is, what are the odds of them seeing one dime from that? Because you have to apply for these grants. At the end of the day, you have to really apply for the money and they deem it. Could that wind up with legal issues if they just deny it all to those centers and just for abortions? Because you're right. They're casing it as they always do. They lie with the words to make it sound palatable, but in reality, it's just for abortion.
Yeah, most of the pregnancy centers want to be super careful about how any state money, most of them do not have any state money given to them or take any state money because they do not want, any, they don't want the states to dictate to them, policies, practices, and procedures within, their walls. If it's a medically licensed clinic, then they operate, within, the medically licensed, parameters for, a medically licensed clinic in the state of California. But that doesn't mean that they need to take state dollars to have any further influence or say or arching influence by the state into their practices. That they want to keep the state out because they don't want the state to dictate, well, this is what you have to say because you've gotten money from us.
I completely, in giving that example, forgot about that, but you're right. That is actually a main reason a lot of people don't take. It happened to us. An investor wanted to invest in our money, and I was like, first of all, that money's only going to last from here to here, but you're going to still be dictating to us what we can or can't do. People look at me as a kid. I act like a kid, and I love having that personality. When I sold my business, and if I was owner, I would never have signed a deal. I still called the shots at my company. We became a subsidiary. The parent company had no say. They had no legal ability to come in and dictate to us. Every time we did a project, they had to they asked us. They didn't have to ask us. And I would just, every single time, I was in bewilderment. Well, how was I able to negotiate that? Because you're right. These family pregnancy centers, I wouldn't be surprised if there's somebody at the state level waiting for somebody to accept the money so they can come in and start dictating. And they just had a big SCOTUS decision themselves a few years ago when California was trying to dictate that they had to have something stipulating abortion, you can get abortion here or there, something like that, where they had to put it on everything. And luckily, the Supreme Court saw it for what it was. So I think
it had to do with whether or not a pregnancy center that had to refer for abortions or not, or whether they had the free speech to decline a abortion referral. And yes,
right.
The Supreme Court ruled in their favor that they were not required to refer for abortions. So
right. In fact, that was one of the first articles I wrote regarding SCOTUS, and this is why the left can win the battle. It's extremely difficult at times to translate these legal terms and what has happened legally into layman terms. Because when you put it in layman terms, you're leaving so much of it out, your critics can attack it. But when you start putting more in there, it just gets convoluted. And what should have been a short synopsis was like this long, drawn out, miserable task I had. And as I do use a couple of programs to check the reading level, it was like college. I'm trying to get it down to 8th grade level. It's extremely difficult. I guess, Karen, I view this as an extremely emotional issue, but I've always believed the internet is the great equalizer, which is why I believe the left wants to completely control the internet. We saw how powerful social media was because they all worked for the left. You can look at the data and it's fact. How they vote, the messages, who they block. I mean, did Twitter actually ever block leftists and go, oh, this was my mistake after the pressure got up? No. So I think that the left is going to have greater difficulty in winning this battle, but only if the Republican Party can get off their tush, grow a spine, and talk. This is like the parents in the Sex and the Bees. Nobody wants to have that conversation. The kid doesn't want to hear his parents talking about this is a condom. This, you know, they don't, you know, and the parent feels awkward, you know. This is that type of conversation. Now, I brought up David Valadao. Are there any races at the congressional level that you think this could play a factor in today? And like you said, it could change down the road, but right now?
Sure. Well, like I said, I think all of the competitive congressional seats in California are certainly going to try to use this as an issue to their advantage. Christy Smith, you know, up against Mike Garcia in 27 was already, you know, spouting, you know, a good bit of this in, you know, recent tweets that were there. You know, there have been, you know, targets, you know, in various media sources, usually, you know, articles that have been written that are going after Michelle Steele and Young Kim, both of whom, you know, have, you know, good records of, you know, supporting life, you know, in Congress, and their records of being pro-life are now under attack. So, you know, yes, I think that, you know, we are going to see, you know, congressional races where this will be a hot topic issue. And I think that most of them will actually be in California. You know, in Texas, you know, we see, you know, you know, one of that of the newer, you know, congresswoman there that flipped, you know, the seat, Myra, remember her last name by any chance?
Flores.
Yes, Myra Flores. She's out there, you know, speaking strongly on this issue in a very, you know, positive and pro way. And, you know, that's the type of voice that, you know, we want to see, you know, go forth and champion a pro-life message, and, you know, as a winner in her seat. So, you know, I think that, you know, we can see it, you know, done properly, but I think it's going to be an uphill battle for those California congressional seats, especially the ones that, you know, could be the most competitive. I think, you know, in other states, you know, there might be, you know, a handful here or there, but I think that generally speaking, this particular issue is more of a fundraising issue. It's more of a firing up issue. It's more of, pardon the pun on firing up, considering our fired up show. It's more of a trying to push out, again, a very populist, you know, drive of, you know, you have a lot of apathy that's going on right now within the electorate. And so this is an attempt to overcome that apathy and give people a reason to turn out and be passionate about turning out. So it's trying to drive up the passion level. Whether it will drive up the actual vote turnout, well, okay, we saw a dismal turnout on the primary, at least was in California. It was a 25% turnout that was there. So Democrats need something to get people to turn out. Now, the general generally has them turning out in higher numbers just because people show up for the general when they don't always show up for the primary. Again, whether this is the issue that's going to get them to turn out, I think we're too far out to be able to really make that determination. But I think it's much more of a passion issue, and it's an attempt to overcome apathy.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
On the surface and deeply as well, but there's that one factor too of educating your voters. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's a lot of Latinos who are pro-life, and if they could just get if they could decide one day, okay, it's a Democratic Latino district, instead of going, we're not worried about that, we're going to focus on our voters, send somebody there, you know, to talk to them, and you'll be shocked. California, hell, you got a Latina as your chair. She should know this. And if she doesn't know this, tell her, go talk to your parents and they can tell you. Or do I have to talk slower, Jessica? You know, I'm just not a fan. You know, I'm not a fan of somebody who enriches themselves off of other people's hardships. And every time we lose an election, it's greater hardships on the constituency. Am I lying when I sit there saying, look at the hardship of paying for gas. Look at the hardship of shopping for groceries. Look at the hardships we've had to deal with increasing blackouts year after year after year, because we're removing our energy sources, but can't replace them with green. You know, so I think these are issues that one of many more that we can win. And I'm actually will be getting more involved in my area. And that's one of the questions I'm going to have for my candidates. I've got two Republicans. I want to know which one is not going to be afraid to have the spine to go out to the people and talk to them. Because I'll be honest, that's the candidate I will support. And I got to be honest, our current incumbent has given one town hall by Zoom this past year, since I've been here in 2002. Now, granted, she's only been in the cycle for maybe 8 to 10 years, I would imagine, but still, never seen that candidate out except for her emissary. And I'm sorry, we did not elect him to office. So I'm really fascinated about this, Karen. I know there were some points you wanted to talk to, and I want to make sure I brought them all up. Is there anything that we're missing that you think that this audience should be aware of?
I think that, we're seeing, a lot more, comments from elected officials that should be challenged in as many ways as they possibly can. And I think that that's really where we can get this conversation and this narrative and this dialogue and this discussion to move to a place of it being about compassion for women, it being about the science of human development. It can be about the value of defending the voiceless and the defenseless. And I think we need to hammer those points home, because I think that they rebut the Democrat talking points most effectively. And I think that they are too often missed in this conversation. And it helps to do exactly what you were talking about bringing it down to that layman's argument. As much as, yes, we do want to also counter the narrative of this didn't actually ban abortion so that people don't have that misconception. They're not going to take a constitution test, and they're not going to pay attention to the fact that it needs to be a constitutional amendment and the hurdles that it would take to, make a constitutional amendment to either, enshrine abortion at a national level or to overturn it and to ban it at a national. See, in my most humble opinion, a constitutional amendment, a U.S. constitutional amendment on abortion, and that's what that topic would go to. And I think driving that talking point is more for the academics and more for the pundits. And I think it's worth commenting in certain circles, but I do think for every elected official that's out there saying, oh, this is a women's rights issue and this is about protecting women, that argument should be countered with it's not protecting women, it does harm to women, it's not compassionate to women whatsoever to push this as the solution for problems that they're already in and that they will still be facing even after making this choice.
Karen, do you see any way they could tie COVID into this? And what I mean by that, these same people screaming all this on the left were wanting to shove a needle in us with something that we didn't know what was in it at first. Now we're starting to hear reports of the portion in the commercial. They tell you how the drug helps you in a 90-second commercial, and 80 seconds is all about the side effects. We're starting to see a lot of side effects starting to come out with this stuff. Is there any way they can tie in they wanted to shove a needle in us with something experimental, and now they're saying leave us alone, to show the hypocrisy? I don't even know if that would help, but to me, it should be explored in some way.
I've definitely seen some individuals commenting, because you did have people that, posted, tweeted, etc., something along the lines of, there was at least one that I saw. It's purely anecdotal. It's not a direction that I would really go, because I think that it has a tendency to stir up further controversy in the wrong way. Abortion's a controversial enough issue as it is. Keeping it singular and focused to that topic, I think, is much more effective than trying to drag in other controversial issues. Newsom tried to do that with gun laws and tried to, equate abortion and gun laws, and he does this sort of like muddled gymnastics to do that. I think that the COVID argument is there. I did see one tweet from one person who was like, mandate vaccines now, and then months later with the abortion decision of, it's my body and, my choice, and, no one but me is able to make a medical decision about my body, and so it was grossly contradictory in those two, tweets that were, grabbed and screenshotted and snapped and then reposted. So yes, there is some of that, but I think it takes the focus away from what we need to be talking about: compassion for women, the science of human, development and life, and the value of defending the voiceless and the innocent.
Right. Now, I keep thinking, hey, we're going to close this out. We're doing well. But I keep getting more questions. Now, Matt Walsh tweeted out, let's make abortion illegal now. I don't know if he was joking. I kind of assumed it was. Then I saw the seriousness of all the responses. And you talked about this earlier tonight at the start of the podcast. But to reiterate to the audience, this is why Roe versus Wade was overturned, was because it's a state issue. Making it a federal law, wouldn't the same thing pretty much happen here? Just to close, I mean, you talked about it once. I just want to put it close out the show with your thoughts on that. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, talk like that, does it hurt us?
Well, because of the controversial nature of abortion, it is extraordinarily unlikely that you're ever going to see a federal law come out of Congress alone on this topic. And again, I can't reiterate enough that there have been opportunities where a singular party has been in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. 2016, we saw it with Republicans. There have been occasions, where it was, controlled, by Democrats, and in neither case are you seeing a federal law come out about abortion? Because the reality is that the next time those three offices and those three bodies, if you will, are controlled by, a singular, party on the other side, it will just become this back and forth. The closest thing we see is like the Hyde Amendment, with that process, depending on who the president is. We're not going to see this as a federal law. The only way to actually either overturn abortion and abolish it and ban it entirely, or to codify it and enshrine it and declare it a constitutional right, either side would have to get a constitutional amendment passed. A constitutional amendment is not going to be passed on this topic because you need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states to all agree on the language. That is not even remotely close to where we are at as a country, as a nation. And what we're seeing after this decision reiterates that fact extraordinarily well. This is a state's issue, and it's going to be determined state by state with the overturning of Roe and the Dobbs decision.
I think most people are naive because of what we've seen from mainstream media. They make the minority of the country sound like the majority. Like you said, with the polling, most people just polling abortion. Yeah. But then when you sit there and say, well, at what point should it end? That's when those numbers at 80% they're always bragging about drops down to 40%. No,
lower than that usually, about 30.
I don't think you'd be burning a child is not abortion. So the difficulties of all this, as you said, it just makes it an impossibility. But again, voting on the day of for that candidate is based on emotional hate from the Democrats. And Karen, I hope the Republican Party nationally and especially in California can look at this battle kind of like that gladiator before he goes into the arena in the Roman era, knowing there's a good chance he's going to be into a brutal, bloody fight that he or she may not come out of, but you got to go in there armed with the facts, the truth. And there's a reason we selected you as a candidate, because we believe you can get your message across to the people. And if you don't do that, I won't be voting for you in the next primary. Karen, any final words before we call it a night?
No, I think I would definitely say match up those candidate statements with what they're saying. And I do think that it'll be fun to see what we do see coming out from some of our statewide candidates and the CAGOP. Even our attorney general candidates are definitely making this a hot topic issue. So we'll keep that as a teaser for next time, because a little birdie told me that there might be a new position statement coming from one of the attorney general candidates that in response and some clarification to a tweet that was made. So we'll throw that out as a teaser, because I'm curious to see what may or may not come from it. But see what happens.
Outstanding. And everyone, you can get fired up and big questions with Big John, points on the board, all at sportsgrumblings.com. Please not only listen, but make sure you share it. And Karen, It's always wonderful to have you. And what I'm going to make sure gets done is, I know you have a couple of articles you've written over the last month. I want to make sure that gets into the chapter list topics so people can head over and read your work as well. But as always, thank you for coming on, and everyone else, we will see you next time on Fired Up.
William, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much as well. Appreciate it.